The courtroom was so dead quiet, you could actually hear the bitter winter wind rattling the glass in the century-old windows. Reporters stood frozen against the oak-paneled walls. High-priced attorneys nervously shuffled their files, and the women sitting in the front row whispered so softly it was as if they were afraid of startling the verdict itself. Every single person in that room was waiting for the arrival of the man the entire city had been talking about for months. When the heavy double doors finally swung open, he walked in with the unmistakable predatory stride of a winner. Max Vance always entered a room exactly like that, like the square footage already belonged to him by divine right. His dark navy bespoke suit fit with absolute perfection, a heavy silver chronograph watch caught the harsh fluorescent light, and a faint, self-satisfied smirk played on his lips. Clinging to his arm was a striking young woman in a tailored white cashmere coat, his mistress, Chloe. She was tall, undeniably gorgeous, and entirely too young for him. She gripped his arm tight, projecting the air of a woman who had already claimed the title of the new lady of the house and the master of his fortune. A low, collective murmur rippled through the gallery. He had actually brought her to court. The sheer audacity of it. His wife was sitting right there. But Max didn't even bother to turn his head. He fed on the attention. He absolutely loved it when people looked at him, whether it was with envy, raw fear, or pure admiration. He loved it especially today because he was dead certain this divorce proceeding was about to end in his total, undisputed victory. After all, he had the most ruthless legal team in the state on his payroll, and his wife had nothing. Irene sat entirely alone behind the long defense table across the aisle. No flashy diamonds, no designer dress, no tears. She wore a simple, austere black turtleneck that only highlighted the stark pallor of her face, her hair pulled back into a severe, low bun. She didn't look like the wife of a billionaire. She looked like a woman whom life had slowly, methodically burned out from the inside. Max let out a quiet scoff as he caught her eye. Once upon a time, it was that exact look of quiet intensity that made him marry her. 22 years ago, Irene had been a completely different person, radiant, fearless, overflowing with life. She was a working architect back when he was just a desperate kid trying to get his first construction firm off the ground. Back then, Max had absolutely nothing to his name except mounting debts, blinding ambition, and a mouth full of beautiful promises. Irene was the first person in the world to believe in him. She sold the apartment she inherited from her parents just so he could bail out his business after his first brush with bankruptcy. She spent her nights drafting blueprints for his projects while he was out hustling for investors. She sacrificed her own career on the altar of his company. And then he got rich. And the moment he got rich, he conveniently forgot who was standing beside him in the trenches. First came the late nights at the office, then the emotional deep freeze, and finally the quiet rumors about very young, very beautiful mistresses. Irene swallowed it all in silence. She did it for their daughter, for the illusion of family, and out of a desperate loyalty to the memory of the man she used to love. But 6 months ago, high-res photos of Max and Chloe were splashed across every gossip site on the internet. They were photographed lounging on a multi-million-dollar yacht off the Amalfi Coast. A week later, Max filed the divorce papers. "You get the lake house and a monthly stipend," he had told her with ice in his veins, not even bothering to look her in the eye. "That's more than generous," Irene had looked at him quietly. "What about the company?" she asked. He actually laughed in her face. "Do you honestly believe you have anything to do with my company?" Irene hadn't said a single word in response, and now here he was sitting across from her in a court of law, thoroughly convinced that in less than an hour he would walk out a free and incredibly wealthy man. Chloe leaned into his shoulder and whispered, "Are we still flying to Dubai after this is over?" Max flashed her a brilliant smile. "Absolutely," he said. "This is already done." Right at 10 a.m. sharp, the judge entered the room. Judge Bennett was a silver-haired, no-nonsense woman who had a terrifying reputation in the city. She could not be bought, and she could not be intimidated. She rarely showed a flicker of emotion and always spoke in a low, measured tone. But it was exactly that terrifying calmness that made the most powerful men in the city sweat through their suits. Max, however, was supremely confident that even she couldn't change the inevitable. He was dead wrong. "We are here to commence the division of assets in the matter of Vance versus Vance," the judge announced, her voice cutting through the silence. Max's lead attorney stood up first. A towering man with a perfectly modulated theatrical voice, he confidently began listing the empire's assets. Prime real estate, blue-chip stocks, offshore holding accounts, Vance Construction, the Aura Hotel Group. Every single word out of the lawyer's mouth was designed to be a blunt force demonstration of power. The vast majority of these assets were acquired by Mr. Vance through his sole entrepreneurial endeavors, the attorney continued smoothly. "My client's wife took absolutely no part in the management of the business and possesses no legal grounds to claim a controlling stake in the holding company." Chloe offered a smug little smile. Max leaned back in his leather chair, totally relaxed. But then Judge Bennett slowly raised her eyes from her files. "Counsel for Mrs. Vance, you have the floor." Every head in the gallery snapped around, and that was the exact moment the bottom fell out of Max's world. Because slowly rising from the chair next to Irene was a man Max hadn't laid eyes on in almost 15 years. Arthur Graham, Max's former business partner. The man Max had brutally betrayed for a massive payout. The blood drained from Max's face so fast he felt dizzy. "That's impossible," he breathed. Graham calmly adjusted his glasses. "Good morning, Max." The courtroom instantly erupted into a low buzz of motion. The press corps practically vibrated with sudden adrenaline. Even Judge Bennett looked at this new player with intense curiosity. Back in the day, it was Graham who had helped Vance build his empire brick by brick. Graham was the financial genius. He structured the deals, found the backers, and kept the company afloat during the darkest days. But then Max forged a mountain of paperwork, funneled the cash out through offshore shell companies, and left his partner holding the bag with millions in crushing debt. After the fallout, Graham simply vanished. The whole city thought he was a broken, ruined man. And now, here he was, standing tall on Irene's side of the aisle. Max gripped the edge of his desk, leaning forward. "What kind of circus is this?" he hissed. "No, Max," Graham replied, his voice steady as bedrock. "The circus was the last 20 years of your life. Today is where the truth starts." Graham dropped a massive, heavy file onto the defense table. "Your Honor, the court has been provided with documented evidence proving that the initial seed capital for Vance Holdings was entirely funded by Irene Vance, alongside a series of key assets registered exclusively in her name during the early years of the marriage." Max shot out of his chair like he'd been electrified. "That is an absolute lie." "Take your seat, Mr. Vance." Judge Bennett snapped her voice, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Graham didn't even blink. He kept going. Furthermore, original incorporation documents from 2002 were recently recovered from the state tax archives. According to these legally binding documents, the controlling 51% stake of the company was originally and permanently issued to Irene Vance. Someone in the gallery actually gasped out loud. Chloe's hand slowly slipped off Max's arm. "What?" she whispered, staring at him. Max looked like he was going to be sick. "Those documents were destroyed years ago," he muttered under his breath. "Apparently not all of them," Graham replied coolly. Judge Bennett began flipping through the papers one by one. Her face remained an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality, but you could feel the atmospheric pressure in the room violently shifting. For the first time since the doors opened, Max Vance looked genuinely terrified. Through all of this, Irene hadn't said a word. She just sat there, staring at the man she used to love more than her own life. And for the first time in 22 years, there was absolutely no pain in her eyes. There was only ice. The judge closed the heavy folder and looked up. The court has also been provided with extensive records detailing the illegal transfer of corporate funds through foreign shell companies registered to proxy individuals. Max's fingers started to tremble, and then came the sentence that sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Pending the conclusion of a full forensic financial audit, all assets belonging to Mr. Vance are hereby temporarily frozen. Chloe whipped her head around to stare at him. Max, you told me you had this totally under control. But he couldn't even hear her anymore, because Judge Bennett was still talking, and every word dropping from her mouth was dismantling his life faster than his brain could process the damage. In light of the overwhelming evidentiary documentation presented, this court finds it necessary to immediately restructure the ownership hierarchy of the Vance holding companies, she stated in that terrifyingly even voice. Until this litigation is resolved, all executive rights and asset management are hereby transferred to a temporary receivership under the direct legal control of Irene Vance, acting as the original holder of the controlling stake. Absolute chaos exploded in the courtroom. Reporters vaulted out of their seats. People were frantically typing out breaking news alerts, others whispering violently into their cell phones. It was the scoop of the decade. Vance was losing everything. Max felt the blood pounding against his temples like a sledgehammer. "This is completely absurd!" he screamed, losing his polished veneer. "Those papers don't prove a damn thing!" Judge Bennett didn't even flinch. "Mr. Vance, if you disrupt my courtroom one more time, I will have the bailiffs drag you out of here in handcuffs." He slowly sank back down into his chair, his insides boiling with panic. His eyes darted over to Irene. She was sitting perfectly still, looking at him, as if none of this was even slightly surprising to her. And that realization terrified him more than the frozen bank accounts, because now he understood. She knew. For months, she had known exactly how today was going to end. Max violently twisted around to face Graham. You set this whole thing up." "No," Graham answered, completely unfazed. "You set this up, Max. You did it a long time ago. Today is just the day the check finally came due." Chloe was nervously running her hands through her hair. "Max, do something. Say something." But for the first time in his adult life, the great Max Vance had no prepared statement. The judge was still reviewing the files. The court is also in receipt of bank statements dating back to 2003, which clearly document the exact transfer of funds from the sale of Irene Vance's inherited real estate directly into the corporate accounts of Vance Construction. Max ground his teeth together. He remembered that day vividly. The cramped, tiny kitchen in their crappy first apartment, drinking cheap coffee. Irene sitting across from him, pushing the signed deed of her childhood home across the table. "Are you sure this is going to save us?" she had asked. "I swear to God," he had said, gripping her hands tightly. "One day I am going to give you the world." She had smiled at him and she had believed him. God, it was so incredibly easy for her to trust him back then. Max jerked his eyes away from Irene, the memory burning him like a physical brand. "Those were voluntary marital contributions to the family business," his lawyer practically shouted, scrambling for a lifeline. "They do not legally mandate a transfer of corporate assets." Graham offered a dark, humorless smile. "Perhaps, but the blatant forgery of corporate incorporation documents is a federal felony." Dead silence. Max felt something deep inside his chest snap in half. "What the hell did you just say?" Graham calmly pulled out a secondary file. "We ran a forensic handwriting analysis. It conclusively proves that Irene Vance's signature on the documents relinquishing her shares was entirely falsified." Chloe slowly hitched her chair away from Max. She was looking at him differently now. The golden aura of the invincible billionaire was gone. She was looking at a man who was drowning with a cinder block tied to his ankle. "Max, is that true?" she asked, her voice trembling. He snapped his head toward her. "Shut your mouth!" But the booming, arrogant confidence was completely gone from his voice. All that was left was fear, raw, ugly, animalistic panic. Judge Bennett took off her reading glasses and looked dead at Max. This court is officially recommending that the district attorney's office open an independent criminal investigation into allegations of severe financial fraud and documentary forgery. You could practically see the dollar signs lighting up in the journalist's eyes. Camera shutters were clicking like machine gun fire. The impenetrable empire of Max Vance was being dynamited in real time right in front of the whole city. And the most horrifying part wasn't the loss of the billions. It was the crushing realization that for the very first time in his existence, he couldn't just write a check to make the problem go away. He was used to buying everyone politicians, defense attorneys, business partners, the media. But right here, right now, his money was completely worthless. Max stood up abruptly. "I need a recess." "Request denied," the judge shot back coldly. And then, for the first time during the entire hearing, Irene finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, incredibly calm, but it cut through the room louder than a gunshot. "Do you even remember our daughter, Max?" He froze solid. The question was so jarring, so completely out of left field, that the entire gallery went dead silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. Max slowly turned his body to face her. "What does Annie have to do with this?" Irene's lower lip gave a microscopic tremble. "She has everything to do with this. You haven't bothered to see her in 8 months." He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. Because it was the absolute truth. The last time he had spoken to his daughter was right after the scandal broke. Annie had seen the paparazzi shots of him and Chloe, and for the first time in her life, she had screamed at her father. "Mom gave you her entire life," she had sobbed, "and you threw her out like she was garbage." He had just walked out the door that night. He didn't even try to comfort his own kid. He was way too busy wrapping himself in his shiny new life, his shiny new girl, his shiny new toys. And only now, standing under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the courtroom, did a terrifying realization hit him. Over the last few years, he hadn't just lost his wife. He had lost everything that actually mattered. His friends, his family, his dignity. Even the people sitting at his table right now were only breathing his air because his bank account had 9 zeros. As if she could read his mind, Chloe slowly moved her hand away from her designer handbag and whispered, "Are the accounts really frozen? Like all of them?" Max stared at her. In that split second, the illusion shattered, and he saw the naked truth so clearly it felt like a physical punch to the jaw. She wasn't terrified for him. She was terrified for herself. "Chloe, we'll talk about this later. Now is not the time." "No, now is exactly the time." Her voice cracked with rising hysteria. "You swore to me there wouldn't be any problems with the money." The gallery started buzzing again. Max could literally feel the foundation of his reality crumbling to dust. Graham just watched the meltdown, his face perfectly placid like a man who had waited 2 decades for this exact theater production. "It's funny, isn't it?" Graham said quietly. "You always operated under the assumption that betraying people made you stronger. But it turns out betrayal just waits patiently in the shadows until it's time to strike." Max glared at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You just wanted revenge." "No, Max. Revenge is cheap. I just wanted justice." Judge Bennett raised her gavel, demanding order. "The court will take a brief recess in chambers before issuing the formal, temporary injunction." She stood up and swept out of the room. The second the door clicked shut behind her, the tension in the room detonated. The press corps rushed the barricade. "Mr. Vance, did you forge the documents? Is it true your offshore accounts have been seized?" "Mrs. Vance, did you plan this ambush?" The court bailiff struggled to hold back the tide of reporters. Max shoved his way past his own lawyers and marched straight toward Irene. Chloe was left standing alone by the defense table. "You orchestrated this whole damn thing, didn't you?" he hissed, leaning over the barrier. Irene slowly stood up from her chair. They were standing inches apart now. Once upon a time, there had been a profound, world-shifting love in the space between them. Now, there was only ash. "No, Max," she said softly. "You orchestrated this. You set this in motion the day you decided I was too weak to ever fight back." He leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "You're trying to destroy me." "No." For the first time, a flash of hardened steel appeared in her eyes. "I just stopped saving you." That single sentence hit him harder than the judge's ruling. Max stood completely paralyzed, unable to break eye contact, because it was true. Whenever he was drowning, Irene was the one who pulled him out. When the banks called in his loans, she found the cash. When his investors threatened to walk, she charmed them into staying. When he would lose his temper, scream at the walls, and disappear for days on a bender, she was the one who covered for him. She lied to their daughter, to his employees, to their friends. She had spent her entire adult life playing his savior, and only right now did he realize how utterly dependent he was on her doing it. The mob of journalists was screaming questions, but the noise faded into a dull roar in Max's ears. He was looking at the woman standing in front of him, and for the first time he didn't see a broken, discarded wife. He saw a stranger, a terrifyingly strong, untouchable stranger. And that scared him far more than a criminal indictment ever could. "Irene," he started, his voice dropping an octave. "We can sit down. We can figure this out." She let out a short, tired laugh. There was no malice in it, just utter exhaustion. "Figure it out. After 20 years of you lying to my face. I provided for you. I gave you everything you ever wanted." "No, Max. You gave yourself everything. I just stood on the sidelines and watched you take it." He opened his mouth to fight back, but the words choked him. Deep down in the darkest corner of his soul, he knew she was right. Over by the tall windows, Chloe was frantically pacing, shouting into her cell phone. All the color had drained from her flawless face. "What do you mean the cards are declining? Hold on, that has to be a mistake. Run the black card again." Max heard her panic, and he physically turned his back on her. The humiliation was washing over him in suffocating waves. He had walked into this building a king. Now the entire room was eating popcorn while they watched him burn. Graham stepped up to the railing. "You know what the ultimate irony is, Max?" he said smoothly. "You could have kept it all. Even after the affairs, even after the divorce papers." Max shot him a dark, venomous look. "Then why do all of this?" "Because it wasn't enough for you to just walk away," Graham said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You had to humiliate her. You wanted to leave her with absolutely nothing. You tried to erase the very person who built you from the ground up." Max looked away, his jaw tight. A memory flashed in his mind. 3 months ago, Irene sitting across the sprawling marble island in their massive kitchen. The divorce settlement was sitting between them. "The lake house is in your name," he had told her with zero empathy. "That's more than enough. Don't turn this into a Greek tragedy." "I gave you my entire life, Max," she had said, her voice breaking. He had literally rolled his eyes at her tears. "Irene, stop playing the professional victim." Those words were echoing in his skull now like a physical beating. He had tossed her away so effortlessly, like her existence was just a minor inconvenience to his schedule. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors swung open again. Judge Bennett strode back to the bench. The chaotic room fell dead silent in a fraction of a second. Max felt his stomach drop into a bottomless pit. The judge sat down, adjusted her microphone, and began reading the final injunction. Every syllable was precise, calculated, and utterly merciless. Based on the undeniable evidentiary record, this court orders that pending the resolution of the criminal fraud investigation, temporary executive control of Vance Holdings, the Aura Hotel Group, and all affiliated offshore entities is hereby immediately transferred to Irene Vance. A shockwave of raw emotion ripped through the gallery. Someone gasped loudly. A few people actually started clapping. Journalists were practically sprinting out into the hallway to broadcast the news live. Max sat frozen in his chair like a statue. He couldn't hear the noise anymore. Only one phrase kept looping in his brain like a broken record. Transferred to Irene Vance. To her. to the woman he had convinced himself was completely powerless. Chloe slowly sank into the chair next to him, looking shell-shocked. Max, how much liquid cash do you actually have access to right now? He slowly turned his head to look at her. It was like he was seeing her for the very first time. There was no pity in her eyes. There was no love. It was pure, unfiltered panic and cold calculation. She was doing the math in her head, figuring out if he was still worth the trouble. Max felt a sudden, violent surge of disgust, but the real tragedy was the mirror she held up to him. He was the one who had taught everyone in his orbit to operate exactly like this, through leverage, through money, through fear. And now that the money was evaporating, the people were vanishing with it. This court is adjourned pending the results of the financial audit, the judge declared. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, echoing like a gunshot, effectively executing the life Max Vance used to know. The private security detail immediately formed a wall around him because the press corps was surging forward like a pack of starving wolves. Mr. Vance, are you preparing for a federal indictment? Is it true your ex-wife is now your boss? Is this the end of your empire? Max shoved his chair back, put his head down, and bulled his way toward the heavy exit doors. But right as he reached the threshold, Irene's voice caught him. Wait! He froze. He slowly turned around. She walked up to him. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the two of them were standing in a small pocket of isolation amidst the screaming chaos of the room. What else do you possibly want from me? He asked, his voice hollow and exhausted. Irene looked at him in silence for a long moment. Then, very softly, she said, I really did love you, you know, with everything I had. The words were delivered with such unexpected gentleness. There was no spite, there was no poison, and somehow that made it hurt 1,000 times worse. Max felt a strange, sharp ache somewhere deep under his ribs. Then why did you do this to me? He asked, his voice cracking. Because loving someone doesn't give you a blank check to destroy them. He looked down at the floor. For the absolute first time in his life, the great debater had zero rebuttal. Irene stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if she was desperately trying to find a trace of the hungry, passionate kid she had met in that cramped, peeling office so many years ago. But that kid was dead and buried. You know what the real tragedy is here? She said quietly. I would have forgiven the cheating. Max's head snapped up. What? I would have. She nodded slowly. But you needed me to feel like I was nothing. You needed to grind me into the dirt to make yourself feel big. And that I couldn't forgive. His mouth went bone dry, because he knew she had just X-rayed his soul. It was never actually about Chloe. It was never just about wanting a divorce. He wanted to win. He wanted to watch Irene break, wanted to see her beg, wanted her to realize she was nothing without him. But standing here now, he was the one who was completely broken. Suddenly, Chloe's shrill voice sliced through the moment. Max, we need to talk right now. She pushed her way through the security guards, completely ignoring the flashing cameras. My private banker is demanding answers, and the management company for the penthouse in Miami just called. They said the holding accounts are frozen. Max closed his eyes, a wave of profound exhaustion washing over him. Not right now, Chloe. No, right now, she snapped, her voice turning ugly. Do you even comprehend what is happening right now? Irene watched the meltdown with a look of serene detachment. Then, completely unexpectedly, she looked at Max. Don't yell at her. Max stared at his ex-wife in total confusion. Irene offered a sad, fleeting smile. She just hasn't realized yet that she was never in love with you. Chloe's face flushed bright red. Excuse me, what the hell is that supposed to mean? Irene locked eyes with the younger woman. You were in love with his bank accounts, and right now your brain is frantically trying to figure out if you can stomach the man without the black card. A brutal, suffocating silence dropped over the three of them. Chloe opened her mouth to fire back, but no sound came out. Because somewhere deep beneath the designer clothes and the ego, she knew Irene had just hit the bullseye. Max looked at his mistress and saw the terror in her eyes, genuine existential terror. And in that precise moment, a massive, yawning void opened up inside his chest. Everything he had chased, everything he had sacrificed his marriage to win, suddenly looked incredibly cheap and pathetic. And then his cell phone started vibrating in his coat pocket. He pulled it out and stared at the screen. It was his daughter. Annie was calling him for the first time in 8 long months. Max stared at the glowing caller ID like he was looking at a ghost. His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. He couldn't process it. Annie never initiated contact, not after the explosive fight, not after she found her mother crying on the kitchen floor, not after the yacht photos went viral. The phone kept buzzing in his palm. Chloe let out a loud, theatrical sigh of frustration. "Are you going to answer that or what?" Max looked up at her, and for the very first time her voice grated on his nerves. It sounded shrill, vapid, empty. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Annie." There was a heavy, static-filled silence on the other end of the line. Then his daughter's voice came through, quiet and tentative. "Is it true?" Max physically turned his back on Chloe and the reporters, taking a few steps toward the frosted glass windows. "Is what true, kid?" "That Mom owns the company now." He squeezed his eyes shut. "While the investigation is pending, yes, it's true." Another long pause, and then he heard a sound he was completely unprepared for. A long, shuddering exhale. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated relief, like a girl who had been holding her breath underwater for years and had finally broken the surface. "Thank God," she whispered. Those 2 words hit him like a freight train. Max felt his chest physically cave in. You're happy about this?" he asked, his voice raw. "I'm happy that Mom doesn't have to be terrified of you anymore." He spun around. Across the room, Irene was speaking quietly with Graham. She looked so composed, so powerful. This was the woman he had spent a decade convincing himself was weak and dependent. Annie kept talking, the emotion bleeding into her voice. "You have no idea what she went through these last few years, Dad." Max gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "Annie, please. I don't need a lecture right now." "Yes, you do." For the first time in the call, her voice cracked with anger. "Because you never listened to anybody but yourself. You only ever saw what you wanted to see." A couple of freelance photographers noticed his tortured expression and started rapidly snapping pictures. Max turned his face toward the glass. "Dad, I remember Mom staying up until 3 a.m. waiting for you to come home. I remember you swearing you'd make it to my high school graduation and you just never showed up. I remember her locking herself in the master bathroom and turning on the shower so I wouldn't hear her crying." Every single memory was a sniper bullet to his conscience, because it was all true. But back then, he always had an airtight alibi ready. A massive merger, a crisis at a job site, an emergency board meeting. He used to look in the mirror and tell himself he was bleeding for his family, when the reality was he was only ever feeding his own massive ego. I never wanted to hurt you guys," he whispered to the glass. A short, bitter laugh echoed through the earpiece. "The scariest part about you, Dad, is that you honestly didn't even notice you were destroying us." Click. The line went dead. Max slowly lowered the phone. A strange, suffocating weight settled over his chest. It wasn't the adrenaline of fear. It wasn't the heat of anger. It was something infinitely worse. It was total clarity. The courtroom behind him was still a circus of noise. Cameras clicking, lawyers shouting, bailiffs barking orders. But Max felt like he was standing in a vacuum completely detached from reality, surrounded only by the ghosts of his past. He saw Irene laughing in that tiny, cramped apartment kitchen. He saw a 5-year-old Annie running into his arms with a crayon drawing. The quiet family dinners, the thrill of the first big paycheck, the early victories. And then the endless, insatiable hunger for more. More leverage, more penthouses, more women, more people telling him he was a god. And somewhere along that bloody climb to the top, he had dropped everything that was actually real. Max! Chloe's sharp voice yanked him violently back into the present. She had marched right up into his personal space. We need to get our lawyers in a room right now. He looked at her with bone-deep exhaustion. Our lawyers? Yes, our lawyers, she shot back, her eyes wide with frantic energy. If the feds start auditing your personal accounts, they're going to see the wire transfers, the jewelry, the deed to the condo. They're going to drag me into this mess. He stared at her, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She didn't give a damn that he was losing his life's work. She was terrified she was going to lose her VIP lifestyle. And right then and there, the last thread connecting him to her snapped. Chloe, go home. She blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Excuse me, what did you just say? I said go home. We're done. Are you out of your mind right now? Max slowly rubbed a hand over his face. He felt like he had aged a decade in the last hour. Just leave Chloe. She stared at him for 5 long seconds, waiting for him to crack, waiting for the apology. But when she realized he was entirely serious, the mask slipped. The pouty, affectionate girlfriend vanished. What was left was pure, venomous spite. You know what? She said, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. You brought every single bit of this on yourself. He let out a dry, hollow chuckle. Yeah, I probably did. No, not probably. You did. You walked around thinking you could just buy people. And yeah, you bought me too. The absolute bluntness of it actually stung because he couldn't deny it. Chloe leaned in, her perfume suddenly smelling cheap and cloying. But here's the punchline, Max. You were so blinded by your own reflection, you didn't even notice that not a single person standing next to you was actually happy. She spun on her designer heels and marched straight out the double doors, the sharp clack of her stilettos echoing off the marble floor. Max watched her disappear into the hallway, and he felt absolutely nothing. No urge to chase her, no heartbreak, no anger, just a massive, echoing void. Hell of a morning, Graham said, casually stepping up to the railing next to him. Max slowly turned his head. Are you getting off on this, Arthur? No, I'm way too old to get a thrill out of watching a man bleed out. Then why the hell did you come out of hiding to help Irene? Graham was quiet for a moment, looking out at the empty judge's bench. Because a long time ago, I lost my entire life because of you. But you know what the absolute worst part of the whole ordeal was? Max looked at him completely drained. What? It wasn't losing the money. It wasn't losing the firm. It was the fact that I started to hate my own guts for being weak enough to trust you. I couldn't let Irene wake up one day and feel that same kind of self-hatred. Max looked away. For the first time, he really looked at his old partner and saw the toll the years had taken. The heavy gray at his temples, the deep carved lines around his eyes, the physical scars of a life derailed by betrayal, scars that Max had put there. Do you honestly think I'm a monster, Arthur? Max asked the question, slipping out before he could stop it. Graham looked at him with a strange kind of pity. No, Max. It would be a hell of a lot easier to sleep at night if you were just a monster. But you're not. You're just a deeply flawed guy who spent way too long convincing himself he was a god. Those words lodged themselves deep in Max's brain. He slowly sank down onto the nearest wooden spectator bench. For the first time in his entire hyper-competitive life, he had absolutely zero desire to fight back. He didn't want to win. He was just so incredibly tired. The courtroom was rapidly emptying out. The reporters had gotten their sound bites and rushed out to file their stories. Irene was standing by the heavy oak doors, quietly slipping her wool coat over her shoulders. She was leaving. Max looked up, and before his brain could filter the impulse, he called out, "Irene!" She stopped. She turned around and looked at him across the expanse of the empty room. What did he even want to say to her? He wanted to say something profound, something that would magically unbreak the damage he had done. but the terrifying reality crashed down on him. There were no magic words left. He had burned through all his vocabulary. It was too late. So instead of a grand apology, he just asked a quiet, pathetic question. Were you ever actually happy with me? Irene stood there in silence for a long time. And then her eyes softened, looking past the expensive suit, past the wrinkles, past the ruin. It was like she was looking at a ghost standing right behind him, the young, hungry, passionate kid she had given her heart to all those years ago. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the very beginning, before the money became more important to you than the people. She pushed open the heavy courtroom door. The biting winter wind howled into the room, bringing the chaotic noise of the Chicago streets with it. And right before she stepped out into the cold, Irene looked back over her shoulder. You know, Max, I honestly think that young kid wouldn't even recognize the man sitting on that bench today. The door swung shut with a heavy, final thud. Max was left sitting entirely alone on the wooden bench, and for the first time in his loud, chaotic, high-speed life, the absolute silence of the room was far more terrifying than any judge's verdict. He sat there, staring at the grain in the wood, long after the courthouse had practically shut down for the day. The fluorescent lights in the hallways flickered into a dimmer, energy-saving mode. Somewhere down the corridor, a couple of security guards were murmuring about the game. A janitor was slowly squeaking a mop bucket across the marble floors. Outside the tall windows, a heavy snowfall had started to blanket the city. Max just stared blankly ahead, completely untethered from time. Irene's final words kept ricocheting around inside his skull. That kid wouldn't even recognize you. 10 years ago, a comment like that would have sent him into a blind rage. He would have weaponized it, called her emotionally manipulative, and drafted a bulletproof rationalization for why she was wrong and he was right. But right now, sitting in the dim light, he didn't even have the energy left to lie to himself. Because for the first time in 20 years, the noise had stopped. The sycophants were gone, and he was finally forced to look in the mirror. And he was horrified by what was staring back. His cell phone vibrated violently against his leg, startling him. He pulled it out. It was his chief financial officer. Max swiped to answer and brought it to his ear. Yeah. The CFO's voice was wound tighter than a piano wire. Mr. Vance, we have a massive situation on our hands. Max let out a dark, breathless chuckle. Do we? I hadn't noticed. The executive stuttered, thrown off by the tone. The banks are demanding an immediate press release. The institutional investors are panicking. The stock took a nosedive the second the news broke from the courthouse. Max leaned his head back against the hard wooden bench and closed his eyes. Just yesterday, a single phone call from him could have stabilized the entire market. Today, his voice was toxic waste. Call an emergency board of directors meeting for tomorrow at 8 a.m., he said quietly. Sir, I'm afraid that's impossible. Max's eyes snapped open. What the hell do you mean, impossible? A painful, awkward silence stretched over the line. Following the judge's injunction, Mrs. Vance has assumed temporary executive control. The legal department just circulated a memo. Every single structural decision has to be routed through her office for approval. Max gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Every new logistical reality was like taking a baseball bat to the ribs. Understood. And, sir, 3 of our major development partners have officially suspended operations on the downtown project. Of course they did. Rats are always the first to realize the ship is taking on water. Max gave a clipped goodbye and hung up the phone. For decades, he had firmly believed that fear was the ultimate management tool. Make them terrified of you and they will never cross you. But fear doesn't buy loyalty. It only buys a temporary hostage situation. And now the hostages were sprinting for the exits. He slowly pushed himself off the bench and started the long walk down the empty corridor toward the exit. The blast of cold air hit him the second he pushed through the revolving doors. Fat, wet flakes of snow were piling up on the concrete steps of the courthouse. His blacked-out SUV was idling at the curb, the driver standing by the rear door with an umbrella. But halfway down the stairs, Max stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time in his life, he felt a crushing dread at the thought of going home, because there was absolutely no one waiting for him. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse in the sky, the ultimate trophy of his success, suddenly felt like exactly what it was: a massive, sterile aquarium made of cold glass and imported Italian marble. No warmth, no heartbeat, no family. "Car is ready, Mr. Vance," the driver called out cautiously, noticing his boss just standing in the blizzard. Max looked up at the swirling snow. "No, take the night off. Go home." The driver blinked in confusion. "Sir, are you sure?" "I said go home, kid." The driver gave a quick nod, ducked into the SUV, and pulled away into the traffic. Max was left standing completely alone on the sidewalk as the city rushed past him. The snow started accumulating on the shoulders of his expensive wool coat. He looked down the street, and a memory hit him so hard it knocked the wind out of him. 20 years ago, he and Irene walking through a blizzard exactly like this one right after he closed his very first legitimate commercial contract. They didn't have a security detail back then, no armored SUVs, no reservations at Michelin-star restaurants. They had ducked into a greasy 24-hour diner, ordered a plate of cheap fries, and laughed until they couldn't breathe, dreaming about the day they would finally make it big. Irene had looked at him across that sticky Formica table with eyes full of absolute worship, like he was a superhero who could bend reality to his will. And back then, his only real motivation was giving her the world she deserved. When exactly did the script flip? When did the money become the master? Max started walking, having no idea where he was even going. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of a storefront window. A graying, exhausted man with dead eyes staring back at him. Not a master of the universe, not a kingmaker, just a hollowed-out guy who figured out the actual cost of his ambition way too late in the game. His phone rang again. An unknown number this time. "Yeah. Mr. Vance, this is Marcus, head of global security for the firm." "What now, Marcus?" "Sir, we just received a formal subpoena from the district attorney's office. They are demanding immediate, unrestricted access to the corporate server archives." Max let out a slow, frosty breath. Of course. The blood was in the water and the sharks were circling. "Send it to the legal team." "They already have it, sir, but there's a bigger issue." Max closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Just say it." "Several key employees have already contacted the DA to offer sworn testimony." Max stopped walking. "Which employees?" "The VP of Finance and 2 former regional directors." Max let out a dark, bitter laugh. And there it was, the final nail. The guys who had happily taken his bonuses and looked the other way for years were now throwing him to the wolves to cut an immunity deal. "Understood, Marcus. Have the legal team prepare for a raid." Max didn't wait for a response. He just killed the call. He stood there on the snowy pavement, the ambient roar of the city rushing in his ears, and a profound, paralyzing terror gripped him. It wasn't the fear of going broke. It wasn't the fear of his name being dragged through the mud on cable news. It was the terrifying realization that he was no longer driving the car. His entire life, he had been the guy writing the rules. Now, the universe was dictating the terms to him. A burst of high-pitched laughter broke his trance. Max turned his head. A young couple was waiting at the crosswalk a few yards away, holding the hands of a little girl in a bright pink snowsuit. The kid was giggling hysterically, trying to catch snowflakes on her tongue, while her dad looked down at her like she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. It was the most ordinary scene in the world, but it gutted him. It ripped him wide open. He remembered Annie at that exact age. He remembered walking through the front door, exhausted, and hearing her scream, "Daddy's home!" before tackling his legs. Back then, he was her absolute hero. And over the years, he had systematically dismantled that love until he was nothing more than a wealthy stranger who ruined her mother's life. Max pulled his phone out with trembling, freezing fingers. He stared at his daughter's contact info for a long time. Then he hit dial. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, the line clicked open. "What?" Annie's voice was guarded, defensive. Max stood there in the snow, his throat completely tight. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that he literally didn't know how to talk to his own flesh and blood. I just wanted to see how you're doing, kid." The silence on the line was deafening. "Are you serious right now?" she finally asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "After 8 months of total radio silence, you're calling to ask how my day was." He squeezed his eyes shut. "I know, Annie, I know." "No, Dad, you don't know." She wasn't yelling anymore. It was worse than yelling. It was the flat, dead tone of total emotional exhaustion. "You didn't even text me on my birthday. You didn't even bother to call when I was in the hospital this winter." Max's eyes snapped open, his brow furrowing. "The hospital? What are you talking about? Mom never told me you were in the hospital." "Of course she didn't," Annie shot back bitterly. "Because she was busy covering for you, like she always does." A cold spike of adrenaline hit his heart. "Annie, what happened?" "It was just a ruptured appendix. I'm fine now, but do you want to know who I was crying for right before they put me under for surgery?" Max couldn't speak. He already knew the answer, and it was tearing him apart. "I was asking for you, Dad." Those words physically knocked the wind out of his lungs. Max stumbled back a step and leaned his shoulder against the brick wall of a corner bodega. The snow was coming down harder now, coating his hair and shoulders. "Annie, Mom told me you guys were busy with finals." He covered his face with his free hand. For the first time in his life, he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole out of pure, unadulterated shame. Because he suddenly remembered where he was that week. While his little girl was being wheeled into an operating room, he was drinking $1,000 champagne on a private beach in St. Bart's, with Chloe posting photos for the world to see. "I am so sorry," he whispered into the phone, his voice breaking completely. The line went quiet again, and then Annie asked the question that finally broke the back of his ego. "Did you ever actually love anyone more than you loved yourself, Dad?" Max opened his mouth, but no words came out, because any answer he gave would be a lie. And in that awful, stretching silence, he gave her the most honest response he had given anyone in a decade. He said nothing. Max stood pinned against the brick wall in the freezing snow, gripping the phone with numb fingers. For the first time in his existence, there was no offshore account, no high-powered attorney, and no PR spin that could protect him from the truth. "You cannot buy your way out of your own reflection." "I don't know what to tell you, kid," he finally rasped, the truth scraping his throat raw. Annie let out a long, trembling sigh. "You know, Dad, Mom used to tell me that deep down, beneath all the ego, there was a genuinely good man inside of you. Even when the rest of the world stopped believing it, she still defended you." Max closed his eyes, the tears finally mixing with the melting snow on his face. Hearing that Irene had protected his image to their daughter even after he had dragged her through hell was the most agonizing punishment of all. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "Why would she do that?" "Because she actually loved you," Annie whispered. Click. The call ended. Max stood frozen on the sidewalk as the blizzard raged around him. Taxis blurred past, people bumped into his shoulders with their umbrellas rushing to get back to their warm homes and their families. The massive, pulsing city kept right on moving, and the man who used to own half the skyline suddenly realized the most terrifying truth of all. He was completely, utterly alone. But standing there in the freezing void, stripped of his armor, something incredibly rare sparked to life inside his chest. It wasn't the fiery rage of a bruised ego. It wasn't the desperate panic of a billionaire losing his toys. It was remorse. Deep, crushing, agonizing remorse. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the spectacular implosion of Max Vance was leading every major news network in the country. Financial anchors were dissecting the court ruling, legal analysts were placing bets on a federal indictment, and the tabloids were feasting on the dramatic courthouse showdown. But for the first time in his life, Max didn't care about the optics. He was sitting in the cavernous, eerily quiet study of his penthouse, staring down at a faded Polaroid photograph. It was a shot of that tiny, cramped kitchen. A young, glowing Irene is throwing her head back in laughter. Max has his arm wrapped tight around her waist. Sitting on the cheap laminate table is a grocery store sheet cake with a single candle sticking out of it. Their first anniversary. They had absolutely zero money to their names back then. But looking at the photo now, he realized that was the only time in his life he actually had it all. The sharp buzz of the penthouse intercoms shattered the silence. Max slowly walked to the foyer and opened the heavy mahogany door. A nervous-looking legal courier was standing there holding a thick stack of binders. "Mr. Vance, I've been instructed to acquire your signature on the legal transfer of temporary executive powers to Mrs. Vance." Max didn't yell. He didn't call his lawyers. He just silently took the pen from the kid's hand, and when he shut the door, he carried the binders to his desk. For the first time in 2 decades, Max Vance signed a legal document without looking for a loophole, without trying to hide an asset, and without trying to screw someone over. He just signed his name on the dotted line, because he finally understood that none of this empire had ever truly belonged to him in the first place. Over the next few weeks, the district attorney's office launched a massive, sprawling federal probe. The old golf buddies stopped returning his calls. The politicians who used to beg for his campaign donations publicly condemned him. The sycophants who had spent years calling him a visionary genius vanished into thin air. But the most shocking twist of the entire saga came from the one person who had the right to destroy him. Irene never fired the kill shot. She didn't do a single tell-all interview with the networks. She didn't leak embarrassing details to the press. She didn't dance on his corporate grave. On the contrary, whenever a reporter shoved a microphone in her face and demanded a comment about her disgraced ex-husband, Irene gave the exact same unwavering response. "I sincerely hope that one day he can find his way back to being the man he used to be." And that was the thing that finally broke Max Vance. Not the judge, not the loss of his billions, not the looming threat of federal prison. It was her absolute unmerited grace. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the tree line, a black car pulled up to the old lake house. The exact same house Max had tried to toss to Irene as a pathetic consolation prize. The warm yellow lights were glowing in the kitchen windows. Max stood at the edge of the driveway for a long time, terrified to take a step forward. And then the front door clicked open. Irene stepped out onto the porch. She saw him immediately. For a long, heavy minute, they just stared at each other through the crisp evening air. He looked drastically different. The arrogance had been completely bled out of him. The predatory, shark-like intensity that used to define him was gone. Standing in the driveway was just a deeply exhausted, humbled man who was finally staring at the wreckage of his own choices. "Why are you here, Max?" she asked, her voice carrying across the lawn. Max looked down at the gravel, and then, for the first time in the entire history of their relationship, he forced out the words he had never been man enough to say. "I came to tell you I'm sorry." Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling through the bare branches of the oak trees. Irene looked at him, her expression unreadable. And then she spoke, her voice impossibly calm. "I forgave you a long time ago, Max." He slowly raised his head, his eyes searching hers. There was absolutely no anger left in her face, just a profound, quiet sorrow. "Then why," he choked out, his voice cracking, "then why does it hurt this damn much?" Irene walked down the porch steps, closing the distance between them just a little. "Because forgiveness doesn't erase the consequences of what you did." That sentence was the final, fatal blow to the armor of a man who had spent his whole life believing he was bulletproof. Max Vance broke down and wept. Not the loud, performative tears of a man trying to win an argument. It was the quiet, agonizing weeping of a man who had been carrying a suffocating darkness inside his chest for 20 years and had finally let it out. And standing there in the twilight, Irene realized that for the first time in decades, she wasn't looking at the ruthless billionaire. She wasn't looking at the master of the universe. She was just looking at a broken man who had figured out the actual value of love entirely too late. 6 months went by. The federal investigation was still grinding its way through the courts, but the dust had settled on the corporate side. The vast majority of the Vance empire had been permanently restructured under Irene's control. But instead of liquidating his legacy out of spite, she did the exact opposite. She stabilized the holding company. She protected the pensions. She saved the jobs of thousands of families who relied on the firm to put food on the table. Because unlike Max, Irene had always understood that true power doesn't lie in your ability to destroy things. True power is having the strength to keep things whole. One quiet Sunday evening, Annie was sitting next to her mother on the back deck of the lake house, watching the water ripple in the fading light. "Mom," Annie asked softly, leaning her head on Irene's shoulder, "do you still love him?" Irene kept her eyes locked on the horizon for a long time. A faint, bittersweet smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Sometimes, sweetie, love doesn't end because the feelings just magically turn off," she said quietly. "Sometimes it ends because the person you fell in love with simply ceases to exist." At that exact moment, miles away on the other side of the city, Max Vance was sitting alone at a small table in a cheap, rented apartment. There was no security detail at the door. There was no heavy silver watch on his wrist. This story is a powerful mirror for our modern lives, reminding us that true wealth can never be measured by a bank account, a luxury watch, or a temporary position of power. In our relentless pursuit of success, status, and the next big achievement, it is heartbreakingly easy to forget the very people who laid the bricks of our foundation. The biggest lesson we can gather from this journey is that relationships are not transactions, and loyalty is not a commodity to be traded away when something flashier comes along. When we choose to humiliate, abandon, or blindside those who loved us when we had nothing, we are not proving our strength. We are merely exposing our internal poverty. True power does not lie in the ability to control or dominate others, but in the capacity to remain grateful, humble, and deeply connected to our core humanity. If we want a better, more fulfilling life, we must learn to value character over cash and presence over possessions. Ultimately, life has a beautiful yet fierce way of balancing the scales, proving that the empire you build by crushing hearts will always crumble under the weight of its own emptiness. As I look at this story from a deeply personal perspective, I see a profound human tragedy that happens all too often when ego blinds the soul. It breaks my heart to see how easily someone can mistake fear for respect and temporary pleasure for permanent happiness. We live in a world that constantly tells us to chase more, but this narrative reminds us that more is a dangerous illusion if it costs us our integrity. I truly believe that the most painful prison in the world is not one made of stone, but the isolation we build for ourselves through arrogance. It is incredibly moving to witness the ex-wife's grace, showing us that maturity means refusing to stoop to the level of those who hurt us. Her mercy was the real victory, because revenge only keeps us chained to the past, while justice allows us to move forward. This story beautifully illustrates that the people who save us from our worst impulses are the ones we should cherish the most. We must wake up to the fact that money can buy a massive house, but it can never purchase a warm home or a daughter's genuine smile. I hope we all take a moment today to look at the people standing by our side right now and give them the appreciation they deserve. Let this be a wake-up call for anyone sacrificing their family on the altar of ambition. Let us choose to be rich in kindness, rich in love, and rich in the things that matter when the lights finally go down. This story and the accompanying commentary are created strictly for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. The views and opinions expressed in this narration represent a personal perspective on human behavior, ethics, and relationships, and should not be taken as legal, financial, or psychological advice. All characters' names and events depicted in this story are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or real-life events, is purely coincidental. Listeners are encouraged to look at this content as a tool for personal reflection and to seek professional counsel for any specific life situations.